Om Ajnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Mukhaṁ karoti vachalam pungum langhayate girim Yat kripatamaham vande Shri Gurun Dinataranam Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatide Shatarine Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Looks like mostly family. Is there anyone here who hasn't been here before, hasn't been to a Krishna center before, hasn't had any connection or experience with Bhakti Yoga? Cool. Or family. Okay. So I can speak freely. I tend to do that anyway. The idea of only connect, the phrase comes from one of E.M. Forster's books. And all of a sudden I'm drawing a blank on which one it is. But it's always hit me as such an essential phrase, an essential, well actually it's a sentence. The subject is implied. It's an imperative sentence, so the you is always implied. And it seems to me, it's always seemed to me, kind of a central theme in Bhakti Yoga, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I remember many years ago, 30 some odd years ago, when I was teaching writing at San Diego State and at Mesa College. One of the courses that I probably taught more than any other is a second semester composition course. And usually, most places, that course focuses a lot on critical thinking. And sometime in the mid-ish 90s, I can't remember just when, 93, 94, something like that. I came across a book for that course that uses as its critical thinking apparatus, bear with me here, semiotic interpretation of American popular culture. Semiotics really just means taking things, examining things as if they were signs, looking for the meaning behind something that shows up in a culture. What values does it show in that particular culture? And one of the things that appealed to me about that book, that really kind of grabbed me, as I think it was probably the instructor's edition. So there's extra kind of stuff to help the professor figure out, why that book and how we might use it. And the authors, two authors of the book, it was actually their husband and wife. I think he taught at Cal State Northridge and she taught at UCLA. Maybe they still do. They said that there are two kind of core ideas behind using semiotics as a way of thinking critically about what's going on in a culture. One was take nothing for granted. Now, as someone who grew up in the early 60s, came to adulthood, I guess, depending on what you call adulthood, in mid-60s and late 60s. I found that appealing. Take nothing for granted. Kind of what goes along with is, there used to be a bumper sticker, question authority. Question authority doesn't mean reject authority. It just means examine it. What's behind this? So I liked that one. And the other idea was everything's connected. And when I read that sentence, everything is connected, I just thought, oh, yeah, okay, I'm all about this book. Because this is what we learn in Bhakti Yoga. Yoga means union. Yoga means connection. And essentially, it means connection with the Absolute. Connection with Krishna, the source of everything. But when we make that connection, because if what we learn in the second, one of the things that we learn in the second canto is that there's a sense in which everything is Krishna and Krishna is in everything. Everything is Krishna in the sense that everything consists of one or another of Krishna's energies, either his internal energy, which is the spiritual world, and those entities who live in the spiritual world, or the material energy, which this stuff, which we think of as inert matter, doesn't have its own volition, doesn't have its own will. This lectern can't make a decision on its own. It moves only when one of us moves it. And then there's something kind of in between, in a sort of liminal space. That's us, the living beings. And and we actually more resemble the internal energy of the Lord. We more resemble the Lord than we do dead matter. However, we have a problem. We tend to identify with this stuff, right? And to the extent that we identify these with the material world, to the extent that we identify with our particular momentary bodies, there's always the possibility of disconnection. We see this right in the very first verse of the Bhagavad Gita. Dhritarashtra is asking Sanjaya. He says, Mamaka Pandavas Chaiva Kemakurvatas. He says, what are my sons and Pandu's sons about to do on this battlefield? Now, I bring this up maybe a little too frequently for some folks' taste, but these are first cousins. Anybody have first cousins? Most of us do, unless our parents were only children. I grew up, at least until I was 9, I grew up in a small town, on the central coast of California. And my first cousins were my best friends. You know, my aunts and uncles' kids. These were kind of the default people that we hung out with. And we were almost like brothers and sisters in some ways. Didn't live in the same house, but we hung out together a lot. And so the Kauravas and the Pandavas, as we know, were first cousins. They grew up together. They were educated together. They played together. Sometimes the play was a little rough. Ask Bhima how he got along with Dushasana and Duryodhana especially. But there was also a lot of camaraderie among them. Even when they were older, you see things in the Bhāgavatam, places in the Bhāgavatam, places in the Mahabharata, where they were actually hanging out together. But because of this kind of sense of separateness, disconnectedness, Dhritarashtra, under the influence of his ambitious son Duryodhana especially, created out of one family, practically as close as you can get, this us and them thing. What are my boys and his boys about to do? And this is really the story of the world today. It seems as contentious as politics were when I was little. They seemed pretty contentious, and then they seemed to get a little more contentious as we got older. Even religion. I went to a church for a few years when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, when we moved away when I was 12. And I remember in 6th grade Sunday school, they started teaching us about the really wrong, really weird, maybe even evil ideas of another church, very large church. And didn't make any sense to me. Because sometimes when I reflect on it, I think, oh man, this is a guy who had an ecumenical spirit before it was cool. This is the 50s, and I was 11 years old. I stopped going to Sunday school at that church. I kept going to church. I kept participating in the children's choir, but I couldn't go to Sunday school anymore because I just couldn't hear that stuff anymore. Because our next door neighbors grew up in that church. They went to Catholic. This is the Roman Catholic Church. They went to Catholic schools, and they were okay. You know, they seemed nice. They were our good friends. Lived right next door. We hung out together a lot, played together a lot. Got in trouble together sometimes, and so it just didn't make any sense to me. So, and then in the 60s, there was a lot of contentiousness in politics, and it seems over maybe the last 15, 20 years, 10, 15, 20 years, things just keep getting worse. And it seems recently, the last year or so, it seems like they get weirder, more contentious, more divided by the day. So we have all the, you know, we develop all these separate interests kind of based on our sense of who we are. And so there's this very, I think, profound sense of disconnectedness that seems to sometimes to get worse by the day, noticeably worse. And we, you know, we don't know what the heck is going to happen. I mean, when the older folks among us were kids, we grew up with the Cold War. We grew up with well, air raid drills, but the air raid drills were for nuclear, you know, get us ready for a nuclear attack. So what were we supposed to do? Close the blinds on the classroom, right? So the blast doesn't. Somehow or other, the blinds are supposed to slow so there's not glass, you know, going all over the place. It's a nuclear, by that time, thermonuclear bomb, for goodness sake. And under our desks, that's supposed to protect us. It was just, it was weird. It was scary growing up like that. And then we had, I think I was 15 years old, 1962. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of '62, where we were verifiably a couple of times about 17 minutes away from all-out nuclear war. It was just so weird to grow up like that. And then we kind of got some relief. And then in the 80s, you had things on TV like there's a mini-series, The Day After. It was about a nuclear attack on the United States, and then there was another one which was even awfuler called Threads, which was a UK production. And so we were all of a sudden, we were worried about nuclear winter again. And nowadays, who knows what in the world is going to happen on any given day. When I was coming back from India a couple of weeks ago, I had an incident with my phone. I was kind of cut off from the whole world for a few days. And I remember as I was flying through the Middle East, I kept thinking, how do I know whether the president's gotten us into a war with Iran or not this weekend? Well, I was off by a week, as it turned out. So this, we have this profound and progressive, I think sometimes, sense of disconnectedness. And it's all due to the kind of self-interest due to our misidentifying our real selves with our actual interest. I've given this example sometimes. Srila Prabhupada, when he spoke at the University of Hawaii in 1972, he was talking along these themes a little bit, and he gave the example of a pond. Please forgive me if you've heard this enough times that it makes you want to run out of the room. But I found it a really striking image. You have a pond with a very tranquil surface, and if you drop a stone in that pond, what will happen is that from the point where the stone contacts the surface of the water, concentric circles will radiate from that point. That's a nice, peaceful image. Sometimes you have meditation apps that you can do something like that, make those kind of concentric circles. So that's nice. So if I were to drop a stone in such a pond, it would make that nice pattern. Now, if Chatura were to drop another stone, it would make the nice pattern as well. And then Subhadra were to drop a stone, and Guru Krishna were to drop a stone, and Mary were to drop a stone. Neela and Anasuya were to drop a stone. Looks really cool for a moment until those concentric circles from those stones meet with mine, and we end up with a chaotic pattern on the surface of the pond. But if each and every one of us were to drop our stone in this, right in the same point, we would just have this continuous pattern of concentric circles. And that's the kind of society that Srila Prabhupada says Srimad Bhāgavatam teaches us by showing us where our real common interest lies. I think last fall when I was here, I read those first two paragraphs from Srila Prabhupada's preface to Srimad Bhāgavatam, where he makes that point, that what's missing is this common interest. And that's actually an aspect of where Srimad Bhāgavatam itself begins. It begins by telling us what the point of the Bhāgavatam is, what it's going to teach us. But it also gives us a clue as to who the most receptive audience will be. Those people who are satam, they're pure in heart. And how is it that they're pure in heart? They're pure in heart because they're nirmatsaranam, or anasuya, right? They're completely free from envy. And how is that possible? They don't have any self-interest, at least any misplaced self-interest. They're not hankering after anything that can be attained in the material world. Kama, artha, dharma, artha, kama, or moksha even, liberation. Those things are referred to in that second verse of the Bhāgavatam as kaitava dharma, as cheating dharma, cheating religion. Why is that? Dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Well, that's what the Vedas give us, right? The four purusharthas, the four great values of human life. Virtue, material progress, the pleasure, the material progress that we might gain by acting virtuously, the pleasures that we might gain through our material progress, and then when we see through the whole scam, We want to be free. We want liberation. So as long as, and Srila Prabhupada talked more times than we can, well, we could probably count it in the database, but it's a really big number about this ism and that ism, right? You have the capitalists and the communists. You have the Presbyterians and the Catholics. You have the Sunnis and the Shias. Or one example that I like to give, because it shows how absurd this can be, is our high school football and basketball teams. I went to Mount Vernon High School in Northern Virginia in the Washington, D.C. area. And, our school colors were maroon and gray, if you can believe it. We didn't. A lot of the students didn't like that. Because they're kind of dull colors, not very vibrant. And our mascot were the majors, I guess because George Washington probably had been a major on his way to being a general or something, I don't know. Maybe, as I mentioned the other day, maybe the generals were already taken by another high school, I don't know. Oh, probably were, because we had a Washington and Lee High School in Northern Virginia. So then, often the most, I was going to say heated rivalry, but that carries a connotation nowadays that I know it's there and it's a little weird because there's some weird TV show and I don't know exactly what that's, but back then, when you're in high school, sometimes the worst rivalry is between the closest high schools. So our closest high school was Groveton High School, and they were the Tigers. Their colors were black and gold. And you go to a football game on a Friday night between Mount Vernon and Groveton High Schools, there's going to be fights. But here's the thing, you go back, rewind a couple of years, because the school districts for the high schools are different from the junior high schools. A lot of the kids at Mount Vernon High School and Groveton High School went to the same junior high school together, and they were buddies. They hung out, got crushes on each other and all that stuff. And some of them go all the way back. They'd been friends since elementary school. But all of a sudden, they're getting into fights, over a call at a football game or something like that. I know we used to take cheap glasses to the basketball games, and if we didn't like the call a ref made, we'd be throwing glasses out onto the court. What are you, blind, ref? So this kind of self-interest really doesn't make any sense, and it's really the cause of friction, our misidentifying ourselves. I'm thinking I'm an old white American man from a particular family. You go back 100, what was it? Maybe 150, 170 odd years to the American Civil War, and you actually had relatives fighting on different sides in that war, sometimes even close relatives, because some family had moved from one state to another or something like that, so they enlisted. So you have it's just this, this kind of disconnectedness is the cause of all our problems. So I was just thinking, I was looking for things that would help me with this idea, this only connect idea. And I was thinking, well, there must be something in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita is about yoga. And in the 2nd chapter of the Gita, Krishna refers to yoga, he says, yoga karma sukoshalam, that devotional yoga, especially bhakti yoga, that's the art of all work. That's what actually brings everything together. So in the 6th, toward the end of the 6th chapter, Krishna says, Sarvabhutastam atmanam, sarvabhutani chatmani, ikshate yoga yuktatma, yoga yuktatma. This is a way of bringing together all the souls. Sarvatra samadarshina. So he says, a true yogi observes me in all beings and also sees every being in me. Indeed, the self-realized person sees me, the same Supreme Lord, everywhere. And we see this explored more fully in the second chapter of the Srimad Bhāgavatam, or second canto of the Srimad Bhāgavatam, where among other things, we are given a universal form, which is, it's a way of seeing the absolute truth, seeing God everywhere in the material world. One of the chapters, I think the sixth chapter, is called Purusha Sukta Confirmed. The Purusha Sukta prayers, as we see in that section of the second canto, is where the philosophy of Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva is presented. Purusha Sukta, they're part of the Rig Veda, one of the four Vedas, one of the original philosophical and theological texts in the world. So this is it turns out it's a really old idea, although the phrase might have been coined by Srila Jiva Goswami 450 years or so ago. And he got that from the way Lord Chaitanya taught Srimad Bhāgavatam. The idea didn't originate with Jiva Goswami. It didn't originate with Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. It didn't even originate in Srimad Bhāgavatam. It's actually taught in the Rig Veda. And in Western philosophy, this idea would be called panentheism. Panentheism is the perspective that God, to use for want of a better word, that God is at once, at the same moment, both immanent, both within everything, and transcendent, completely aloof from everything. He doesn't switch. He doesn't have to do the fake multitasking that we do in this world. Although sometimes I would see Badrinarayan Maharaj trying to catch up on his correspondence in the middle of Srimad Bhāgavatam class. And there were first few times I noticed that I thought, that's a little interesting. But then, without fail, when it was time for discussion at the end of class, he would show that he was right there. So I don't know how you switch back and forth like that, because we can't really do two things at the same time. Our brain is really switching back and forth. But that's rare. That's something I could not have done. I don't do multitasking, even the pretend kind. But this is inherent in the absolute truth. The absolute truth is at once within everything, pervades everything, and at the same time, absolutely aloof from everything. It has his own business going on in the spiritual world. Not business, his own play going on, especially in Vrindavan. What he does, there's activities there are called lila, although he tells us in the Bhagavad Gita, janma karma cha me divyam. He uses the word karma for his activities. But it's really just lila. He doesn't have any business. There's a story Srila Prabhupada told about, I think it was one of his godbrothers from Europe came to India. A couple of godbrothers who became involved in Bhakti Yoga through the Gaudiya Mat, through Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur and his disciples. And this one seeker came to India, and he was looking for the highest kind of God, I guess. And he noticed when he would see the images of these different devatas in different temples around India, they all had some instruments that had to do with some business they had to carry out in the world. And then he saw the images of Krishna in the temples, and Krishna's just hanging out playing a flute. And he thought, oh, this must be the Supreme, because he didn't have anything to do except play. So Krishna's karma is actually lila. It's actually play, especially in Vrindavan. This is a conception of the Absolute, a conception of the Absolute that makes any conceptions, any other conceptions of God that we have, that I'm aware of anyway, seem, as I've pointed out, kind of pale and shallow by comparison. I mentioned this morning the first word of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which is a study of how bhakti works. It's written by one of our previous teachers, Srila Rupa Goswami. First word is an address to the Absolute Truth, Sri Krishna, as Akila Rasamrita Murti. In other words, he's the embodiment of all kinds of love. And he tells us in the Gita that he's able to respond to both the manner and depth of everyone's approach. Now, that means, of course, also, as we see in the Srimad Bhāgavatam, and as we see in the Gita itself, as we see just after the Gita, when the war actually takes place, sometimes that approach is negative, and he can respond in kind. Just as we see in the Bhagavatam with Lord Nrsingadeva and Hiranyakashipu. Hiranyakashipu approached the Lord with enmity, envy. And the Lord showed him, the fruit of that kind of attitude, which is annihilation. And liberation at the same time, this special thing. He's actually able to multitask. He can take them out and liberate them at the same time. The Bhagavatam teaches us, and Lord Chaitanya teaches us that, how am I doing? Okay. That real oneness is in Krishna. Understanding who we really are in relationship with Krishna, in relationship with the Absolute Truth. So, Srila Prabhupada's message seemed often to be driving home this one idea. You're not that body. Because I have a long habit, not just in this lifetime, a long habit over more lifetimes than I can even imagine, much less count, of thinking that whatever I happen to be trapped in, and sometimes it does feel like a trap, especially when you get close to 30, like a couple of us here are. We think that's me. We think that's, the extent of, and whatever is closest to me is more important. Closer something is to me, the more important it is. My stuff, my family, my wife, my children, my cousins, my grandpa, my car, my job, my nation, my high school, my church. And these are all very limiting perspectives on the world. And that's where the conflict is, because sometimes what I see as my interests with regard to this body might conflict with Subhadra's. And there might be a little tension. Oh, no, let's get closer than that. I was married for 40 years. There were times, they were very few and far between, let me assure you, when my former wife and I didn't see eye to eye on something. So even that close, or our kids, God, especially once kids, especially boys, by about 10, they start to kind of like get a new sense of independence. They get their first kind of adolescence when they're 2, and their favorite word becomes, any parents here? No. And then when they're 10 and through their teenage years, there's a lot of conflict because trying to establish themselves as independent entities. And we're trying to, well, let's say, guide them the right way. And sometimes that doesn't work out. So as long, to the extent that that self-interest persists, there's going to be conflict. But Srila Prabhupada points out in that preface to the Srimad Bhāgavatam that the Bhāgavatam teaches us another perspective, an Ishavasya perspective. This is what I got out of his analogy of the stones in the pond. And I had an idea for what I thought might be a Back to Godhead article that I never actually wrote, of an Ishavasya society, that this is a one way to kind of see this God-centered society. And I remember back in probably late 1969, very early 1970, when I started reading Srimad Bhāgavatam, after spending some time with Bhagavad Gita, I became closer to the temple. And when I would go to the temple, I would sit in the temple room sometimes and read Srimad Bhāgavatam. And in his purport to that second verse, where Srila Prabhupada, where Sutta Goswami talks about the purpose of the Bhāgavatam and the audience for the Bhāgavatam as being people who are satam, pure at heart, near matsaranam, because they didn't have any self-interest. There was no sense of competing for the resources of material nature, for prestige, for money, for anything. And when he's discussing that deep into his purport, Srila Prabhupada writes how those who are devotees of Krishna, they don't have this sense of competing with each other. He said that the whole world is moving because you've got one man competing with another man, one woman competing with another woman, one nation competing with another nation, one animal competing with another animal for something or another. And he wrote, but the transcendental devotees of the Lord don't compete with others for any of these things. Instead, he said, they strive to create a competition-less society with God at the center. And when I read that sentence, I was fascinated by the philosophy of Bhakti Yoga, philosophy of the Gita and the Bhagavatam, to the extent that I understood it at that point. But when I read that sentence, I saw one thing. This is 1969, 1970. I saw this is the revolution that we've all been looking for. I couldn't imagine a more revolutionary concept than a competition-less society with the absolute truth as the center. And that way, everyone has that same common interest, pleasing Krishna. That's what life in Vrindavan is all about. Everybody, everything they do is to increase Krishna's pleasure. And, well, even more than that, to bring Krishna together with Radharani, which is what makes him happiest. Even when there's struggle, we see when Krishna's a boy in Vrindavan, Mother Yashoda tucks him into bed at a decent hour because she wants her boy to grow up big and strong, right? And as soon as that latch closes on the door, he's out the window. He's out the window, he's going out to the forest to hang out with the gopis. And then he kind of sneaks in at the end of the night, and the whole thing kind of starts over again. So there may be some apparent tension between Mother Yashoda's interests and the gopis' interests. But actually, Mother Yashoda's real interest is that Krishna be happy. And the gopis' only interest is that Krishna be happy. And Nanda Maharaj's only interest is that Krishna be happy. And his buddies, their only interest is that Krishna be happy. Even when they're out in the forest, in Talavan, and they're starting to feel hungry. But actually, they really want to satisfy Krishna. Oh, Krishna, we're hungry. And those fruits smell really, really good. And there's a whole new adventure there. So that's the kind of connection that will really satisfy the soul. And that comes about as we begin to perceive more clearly who we really are We only know what our real interests are when we have a good sense of who we are. If I thought I were Napoleon Bonaparte, what would I think my main interest is? I'd got to conquer Russia. Didn't work out so well, but I think I got to do that. I think I have to conquer all of Europe. But if I understand I'm a goofy, neurotic kid from Lompoc, California, and somehow or other I have been drawn into this Bhakti chakra, this circle of devotion, by the grace of my spiritual master, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, then there's a completely different interest. And I find ways to work together with those who share that interest, to advance that interest. And what is that interest? To give more pleasure to Krishna by bringing more of his lost souls to him. Krishna says in the Gita, Patram pushpam palang toyam yome bhaktya prayachati. He says, just offer me. If you offer me even something as simple as a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or some water, with devotion, I will accept it. He doesn't need my, I got a bunch of banana trees planted around my hut in Honolulu. And he doesn't need the bananas that I grow there. But if I bring them to him with whatever affection I can muster, to that extent, he's happy to accept them. They also happen to be quite delicious bananas. So it's that bhakti that he's accepting, not the stuff so much. He accepts the stuff to make us feel good, to make us feel fulfilled by offering something to Krishna. So sometimes I'll suggest that, what do you give that person who has everything? Well, we have to find one thing that he's missing. And what is that he's missing? My love. Certainly my heart, right? So Krishna is bhavagrahi janardana. He accepts our intention. He accepts the feelings behind our offerings. The bhava, whatever feeling, whatever affection we're able to muster, Krishna accepts that. And that satisfies the soul. So how do we get there? Well, we're still not too far from Gaura Purnima, the appearance of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the 540th anniversary of his appearance, which we celebrated here on the West Coast this past Monday. And I was in Los Angeles on Monday, and we didn't know that. When we were planning my trip, we weren't planning around festivals. We were just kind of planning around good plane fares, I guess, best plane fares or something. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in Los Angeles for Gaura Purnima. I'm going to be in Los Angeles for Nityananda's appearance day, and a month later for Lord Chaitanya's appearance day. I hadn't been there for Lord Chaitanya's appearance day maybe since 1973, before I was even married. That's a long time ago. So, and that was kind of, it was a nice thing. I missed being in one of the two places where I usually have been the last few years for Gaura Purnima, which is either here or Honolulu. So Lord Chaitanya taught us how we can actually clarify our sense of self. And that's through Sankirtan. Coming together, joining our hearts. What does that bag say? Jahnavi? I gave it back to you because you asked, but I really like it. One song, many voices. Many hearts, one voice, in a sense. We come together to glorify that person who's given us everything, Sri Krishna. So Lord Chaitanya tells us that the very first effect of engaging in that Sankirtan is that our sense of who we are becomes progressively clarified. Ceto darpanam arjanam. Just as when we look in a mirror, you all know this, is when we look in a mirror, if the mirror's been in an attic for 130 years or something like that, all kinds of dust and grease and stuff have accumulated on it, bug poo and all kinds of stuff. And we look at ourselves in that mirror, and we may not be able, we try to put our tea-lock on or our makeup on or something like that in that mirror. It's not going to work out so well. So we clean the mirror. And the more we clean it, the more clearly we see who we are. You can see, of course, what I see in the mirror nowadays is a little shocking, because I still have a sense that I'm, maybe some dopey 20-something-year-old kid or something. But, and then I see this geezer staring back at me. I had this experience many years ago, actually. It was quite a jarring experience. Visiting my dad, my family was visiting my father, and he had my high school graduation picture on a shelf in his office at his house. And my dad often, a lot of his businesses that he owned, he ran from his house. And, it's a picture of a barely 17-year-old me with a bow tie and a white dinner jacket, graduation picture. And I walked past the picture, and I actually did a triple take. I thought, oh, what? And I picked the picture up off the shelf, and I was on my way to the bathroom, and I took it into the bathroom with me, and I held it up, and I looked in the mirror. And at that time, I wasn't even 40 years old, but I was like, oh, my goodness. A little hard to see me at all in that picture nowadays. So we get this progressively clearer sense of who we are, and that helps us get a progressively clearer sense of what our real self-interest is, which is this yoga, connecting with the Absolute. And through connecting with the Absolute, connecting with everyone else. Somewhere in the scriptures there's this phrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbitam. We're all one family. Srila Prabhupada wrote me that in a letter back in 1973. He says, we've created something significant in the form of this International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and we are all one family. That's been my watchword ever since then. And that's kind of why that only connect, everything is connected. All those kinds of sentences, why they seem to connect with me. So this is actually the great gift of Lord Chaitanya, this Sankirtan, especially the chanting of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, which I spoke about a little this morning. And so I think that's kind of, Mr. Zuckerberg, what was on my mind when I started thinking about what I might talk about tonight. I think I'll stop here uncharacteristically on time and leave some time for any discussions. Of course, there's also an elephant in the room, a connection, since we are all family, a connection that we're all missing. And I could give a talk about how we're not the bodies, that whoever is born is destined to die, and whoever has died is destined to take birth again, and all that stuff. But that doesn't work, I don't think, in these situations. That became very clear to me when last year one of the members of our community in Honolulu died quite suddenly and shockingly at the age of 42. And this was someone who I was just really getting to know, and I was just starting to see what a deep person he really was, even though he'd had some rough periods in his life. And I was just thinking, oh, I need to get to know this devotee better, because he just, it seems like my life will be enriched by getting to know him better. And they asked me to speak at his memorial, and I just said, it's time for us to cry together. That'll be our activity, I guess. Next Sunday morning, we'll get together to cry. But we don't want to miss that connection as well, because it's that presence that actually was a big part of what kept this community together for dang near 40 years. And so that's something that we also need to acknowledge. As we go along, we find so many of these losses in our lives. So many of us here are connected by the losses of those whom we love in common. And so that connection, I think, is also something that we need to acknowledge and embrace, even the loss. But anyway, I was thinking about that when I looked at the chart and saw that I was scheduled to speak tonight. I thought, okay, what am I going to talk about? I just thought that phrase came, only connect. I hadn't quite figured out what to do with it. I still haven't, but this is what I did with it in the last 45 minutes. So, anyone have any comments or any questions or discussion? Anything for further discussion? Chatura? You have a soft voice. I do have my hearing aids in, but I still might miss it.
Maharaj, it's so nice to see you and hear from you. Thank you. Please come more often if you can. And you mentioned Honolulu. Would you spend a little time telling us a little bit about the worship of Sri Panchatattva in New Navadvip, Honolulu?
Thank you for that question. It takes me home. And I was, whenever I have the opportunity to go to Laguna Beach for the regional Gaura Purnima festival, I'm always happy because reasonable facsimiles of my deities are there. Our deities are Panchatattva. I remember when I was in Mayapur, I think it was last year, on Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati's disappearance, I was standing next to Shrutakirti Prabhu in the temple in Mayapur. And Maharaj said, kind of like being home, yeah? And I said, yeah, there's these facsimiles of my deities here. Of course, they're like 3 times their size and really overwhelming. This is actually the hallmark of the Panchatattva. Srila Prabhupada writes about this in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, in the 7th chapter of Adi Lila, how the main characteristic of the Panchatattva is that they broke open the storehouse of love of God and distributed the contents freely without discrimination. So Srila Prabhupada was he showed his broad vision and his brilliant vision when he decided to make Panchatattva the worshipable deities of ISKCON in Hawaii. Originally, I think he had in mind installing some Radha Krishna deities. But he had named, because we're a group of islands, there are 8 main islands. I read recently there's a 9th island called Las Vegas, Nevada, because a lot of folks from Hawaii can't afford to live there anymore, so they find themselves, I don't understand how, in exactly the opposite place, where the weather is unbearable. There's no water, nothing grows natural, hardly anything grows natural. Anyway, so Navadvip means 9 islands, and this is where Lord Chaitanya appeared in West Bengal 540 years ago. And so because when he came in 1969, Srila Prabhupada realized, okay, so we're living on these islands. So he said, this will be New Navadvip. Now, there's another New Navadvip that seems to be springing up in Texas. And I'm on a part of a chat online where somebody from that temple was talking about sending cases of oranges from New Navadvip Dham to all the temples in North America. And I never got a response to the question, will there be a case on its way to the original New Navadvip Dham? So Srila Prabhupada's idea was that we flood the islands, the Hawaiian Islands, with Sankirtan, and that would be inspired by our deities, Sri Sri Pancha Tattva, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Lord Nityananda, Advaita Acharya. Advaita Acharya, who, as Lord Chaitanya sometimes complained, forced the Lord to come, right? He hunkar, the word that's used in, I think, both Chaitanya Bhāgavata and Chaitanya Charitamrita is hunkar, his bellowing, his demand. Things are messed up. You need to come now, my Lord. And so sometimes Lord Chaitanya would complain, oh, Nara has dragged me here against my will. Of course, it was also Lord Chaitanya, Sri Advaita Acharya, who released him at the end of his Acharya Leela, his teaching Leela, and said, okay, the rice merchant can retire now because the market's flooded. In other words, everyone's already going nuts with Sankirtan. Now you can go take care of the confidential reasons for which you appeared, which are described in the 4th chapter of Adi Leela and Chaitanya Charitamrita. And then Gadadhar Pandit, whose mood of loving Krishna Mahaprabhu actually stole, in a sense, because this is Krishna having the confidential reasons for which the Lord Chaitanya appeared were that Krishna was having an existential crisis, kind of. He was seeing that his devotees, and especially Srimati Radharani, were obviously enjoying something that he couldn't conceive of, much less understand. Somehow or other, I'm supposed to be, Akila Rasamrita Murti, the embodiment of all varieties of love. I'm Rasaraj, I'm supposed to be able to enjoy everything. But they're having more fun than I. What is that about? I need to know. So that's that confidential part that he was able to explore in the last few years of his pastimes. And then Srivas, on our far right, Srivas Thakur, in whose home Lord Chaitanya would, when he was in his householder Leela, Lord Chaitanya would enjoy Hare Krishna Sankirtan all night long with his most confidential associates. So their business, Srila Prabhupada writes, is to break open the place where this very rare thing, pure love of God, especially the kind of love that's enjoyed, the 4 kinds of main varieties of love that are enjoyed by the residents of Vrindavan, completely free from any encumbrances by this sense that Krishna is God. Because that kind of awe and reverence gets in the way of the intimacy that Krishna really wants. He says in Chaitanya, he has Krishna, Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami has Krishna thinking, even the love of Vaikuntha, that doesn't excite me so much. It's not so interesting. It's just, there's too much distance. He wants that kind of intimacy, that barefoot love. Krishna runs around barefoot in Vrindavan. That's part of the significance of the appearance of the Panchatattva, especially in, first in New Navadvip in Hawaii, and now we see Panchatattva temples in all parts of the world, California and India, in Mayapur, and in several places in Europe as well. They have temples where Sri Sri Panchatattva are the deities. And those of us who had the pleasure, the good fortune of being able to serve their lotus feet, Srila Prabhupada said they don't accept offenses in their worship. They do, however, take exception to offenses that we might commit to other devotees. And I've seen devotees be excused by the deities from New Navadvip when they dealt roughly with other devotees many times. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
We only have a minute, so I'm wary of entertaining another question. And I see Mukunda is locked and loaded with an announcement.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to me.